What if I told you there's a Ford that was so aerodynamically perfect, NASCAR had to rewrite their entire rulebook just to stop it? Picture this. It's February 1969, and David Pearson's Midnight Blue Torino crosses the finish line at Daytona, averaging 157 miles per hour for 500 miles. The competition isn't just beaten, they're demoralized. This is the story of the Ford Torino Talladega, the car that turned air into a weapon and scared NASCAR into submission. The late 1960s weren't just about horsepower anymore. NASCAR's superspeedways had exposed a new truth. At speeds approaching 200 miles per hour, aerodynamics mattered more than cubic inches. Dodge had fired the first shot with their Charger 500, smoothing out the standard Charger's recessed grille and tunneled rear window. The Charger 500 could slice through air like nothing before it, and suddenly Ford's boxy Torinos were getting left behind on the high banks of Daytona and Talladega. Bill France had just opened Alabama International Motor Speedway, later renamed Talladega, with its 33-degree banking and 2.66-mile length. This wasn't just another track, this was the fastest closed course on Earth, where aerodynamic drag would separate winners, also rans. Ford's racing director, Jacques Passino, knew they needed something radical. The standard Torino's flat nose created a wall of air resistance at high speeds. Wind tunnel testing showed it had a drag coefficient of 0.42, about as aerodynamic as a brick wall. Ralph Moody at Holman Moody got the call. Ford needed a Torino that could cheat the wind. But here's where it gets interesting. NASCAR required manufacturers to build at least 500 street versions of any car they raced, the homologation rule. This meant Ford couldn't just build a handful of wind tunnel specials, they had to commit to a production run. The transformation began in Dearborn's wind tunnel. Engineers discovered that extending the Torino's nose by just 6 inches would dramatically reduce frontal pressure. They weren't adding power, they were removing resistance. The grille was laid back at an angle, flush with the hood line. The front bumper was rolled under and tucked tight to the body. The rocker panels were re-rolled to sit 3 inches lower, smoothing airflow along the sides. But the real genius was in the details nobody could see. The entire front clip was redesigned with rounded edges instead of sharp corners. Even the headlight bezels were reshaped to eliminate tiny pockets of turbulence. Ford's engineers were thinking in millimeters, knowing that at 190 miles per hour, a quarter-inch ridge could cost you 2 miles per hour on the straightaway. Each production Talladega started as a standard Torino at Ford's Atlanta assembly plant. Then something unusual happened. Instead of rolling off the line complete, they were shipped to Holman Moody's Charlotte facility for finishing. This wasn't just dealer prep, this was race-level attention. Holman Moody's technicians hand-fitted every panel gap, ensuring perfect alignment. They massaged the sheet metal where dies had left imperfections. They even adjusted the angle of the rear window to optimize airflow separation. Under that sloped hood sat Ford's 428 Cobra Jet, officially rated at 335 horsepower. But everyone knew that number was conservative. With its 10.6.1 compression ratio, solid lifter cam, and 735 CFM Holley 4-barrel, the real number was closer to 400. The engine breathed through ram air induction that fed cold, dense air directly to the carburetor. The C6 automatic transmission was beefed up with a 2,800 RPM stall converter and heavy-duty clutches. The 9-inch rear end packed 3.25.1 gears with a traction lock differential. Ford built exactly 750 street Talladegas between January and March 1969. They came in just 3 colors, Wimbledon white, royal maroon, and presidential blue. No stripes, no scoops, no wings. The only external clues were the extended nose, flush grille, and special Talladega badges. Most buyers had no idea they were driving a homologation special. The sticker price was $3,880, about $29,000 in today's money. For comparison, a base Torino GT cost $2,840. Meanwhile, the race versions were getting serious modifications. The 428 was replaced with either the 4i29 Boss or the legendary 4i27 FE, both pushing well over 500 horsepower in NASCAR trim. The suspensions were completely rebuilt with fabricated control arms, coilover shocks, and massive sway bars. The bodies were acid dipped to remove every ounce of unnecessary metal, strengthened with roll cages that tied into the frame rails. The wind tunnel numbers were staggering. The production Talladega achieved a drag coefficient of 0.30, better than a contemporary Corvette. The race cars, with their perfectly smooth undersides and taped seams, got down to 0.28. To put that in perspective, a modern Toyota Camry has a drag coefficient of 0.27. This was a 1969 muscle car achieving modern aerodynamic efficiency. Dodge wasn't sitting still. They responded with the Charger Daytona, adding that famous pointed nose cone and towering rear wing. The Daytona was faster in a straight line, but it was also unstable in traffic. The wing created so much downforce that it would literally lift the front end at certain speeds. The Talladega, with its balanced design, was predictable and confidence-inspiring at the limit. The first major test came at the 1969 Daytona 500. Leroy Yarbrough put his Talladega on the pole with a speed of 194.015 mph. During the race, the draft battles were intense. Cars were running in packs at speeds never before seen in NASCAR. Yarbrough would go on to win, but the real story was the speeds. The race average of 157.950 mph shattered the previous record by nearly 7 mph. At Talladega Superspeedway in May, the speeds got even crazier. During practice, drivers were touching 200 km/h down the backstretch. The tires weren't designed for these speeds. Firestone and Goodyear were seeing catastrophic failures, tread separation at full speed. Several drivers crashed during practice when their tires exploded without warning. The situation got so dangerous that most of the top drivers, including Richard Petty, boycotted the race. Bill France was furious, but the drivers had a point. The combination of the new aerodynamic cars and Talladega's high banks had pushed beyond the limits of tire technology. The race went on with a depleted field, and Richard Brickhouse won in a Dodge Daytona. But the writing was on the wall. By the end of 1969, the Talladega had won 26 races. David Pearson captured 11 victories in the NASCAR championship. Donnie Allison, Cale Yarborough, and Dick Brooks added more wins. Ford dominated the superspeedways so thoroughly that Chrysler threatened to quit NASCAR entirely. Here's the thing about aerodynamics. Once you understand it, you can't unlearn it. The Talladega proved that reducing drag was more effective than adding power. A car with 500 horsepower and terrible aerodynamics would lose to a car with 400 horsepower and clean airflow. This fundamentally changed how race cars were designed. Suddenly, every manufacturer was hiring aerodynamicists and building wind tunnels. But NASCAR had a problem. The speeds were getting dangerous, not just for drivers, but for spectators. A 3,400-pound car traveling at 200 mph carried the kinetic energy of a small bomb. If one of these cars went airborne and cleared the catch fence, the results would be catastrophic. Insurance companies were getting nervous. Track owners were worried about liability. For 1970, NASCAR introduced plates to restrict airflow on superspeedways, but it wasn't enough. The Aero Wars continued with Plymouth Superbird joining the battle. Bobby Isaac set a closed-course speed record of 201.104 mph at Talladega in a Daytona. The cars were literally outrunning NASCAR's ability to control them. The hammer fell for 1971. NASCAR announced that any car with aerodynamic aids, including the Talladega's extended nose, would be limited to 305 cubic inches of displacement. The standard-bodied cars could run up to 430 cubic inches. This weight-to-power penalty made the Aero cars instantly uncompetitive. Just like that, the most advanced stock cars ever built were obsolete. Ford had spent an estimated $2 million developing the Talladega, about $16 million today. They'd revolutionized aerodynamic understanding in motorsports. They'd proven that science could beat brute force. And then they watched it all get regulated away. But Ford understood something that NASCAR was just beginning to grasp. They'd opened Pandora's box. Once teams understood aerodynamics, there was no going back. The street Talladegas became instant collectibles, though it took years for values to reflect their significance. Many were modified or wrecked, unaware owners not realizing what they had. Racing Talladegas were converted to other series or scrapped when they became obsolete. Today, fewer than 400 street versions are believed to survive. The racing world learned from the Talladega's dominance. Formula One increased their focus on aerodynamics. IndyCar developed ground effects. Even NASCAR, despite banning the Aero Specials, incorporated wind tunnel testing into regular development. Every modern race car owes something to the lessons learned in 1969. The Talladega's influence extends beyond racing. Ford applied aerodynamic lessons to production cars throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The idea of extending body panels to reduce drag became standard practice. Wind tunnel testing moved from racing exotic to production necessity. Fuel economy regulations in the 1970s made aerodynamics crucial for meeting CAFE standards. Let's talk about what made the Talladega truly special from an engineering perspective. The boundary layer control was revolutionary for its time. Air flowing over a car's surface creates a thin layer of turbulent air that clings to the body, the boundary layer. The Talladaga's smooth, extended surfaces kept this layer attached longer, reducing the size of the turbulent wake behind the car. This wake is what creates drag, pulling the car backward like an invisible parachute. The front extension wasn't just about moving the nose forward, it was about managing air pressure. At high speeds, air compresses at the front of a vehicle, creating high pressure that pushes against forward motion. By extending and sloping the nose, Ford's engineers gave that compressed air more time and space to flow around the car rather than push against it. The pressure differential between front and rear decreased, reducing overall drag. The flush-mounted grille served double duty. It reduced frontal area while still allowing cooling air to reach the radiator. The angle was precisely calculated. Too steep and it would create lift. Too shallow and it wouldn't flow enough air. At 35 degrees from vertical, it hit the sweet spot. Cooling drag, the resistance created by air flowing through the radiator, was reduced by 18% compared to the standard Torino. Even the door handles were reconsidered. Stock Torinos had protruding handles that created tiny vortices at speed. The Talladega's handles were recessed just a quarter-inch deeper, but wind tunnel testing showed this saved 0.3 amp at 90. So that might not sound like much, but in a 500-mile race, those tiny gains added up to victory. The suspension geometry was modified to achieve the ideal ride height and rake angle. The car sat lower in front than rear, creating a subtle wedge shape that helped air flow over rather than under the car. Too much air under a car creates lift, reducing tire contact and stability. The Talladega's flat undertray and lower ride height minimized this effect. Here's something most people don't know. Ford experimented with active aerodynamics on test mules. They tried a system where the rear spoiler would automatically adjust angle based on speed, increasing downforce in corners and lying flat on straights. It worked but was deemed too complex and illegal under NASCAR rules. This technology wouldn't appear in production cars for another 20 years. The Talladega program also advanced tire technology. The extreme speeds exposed weaknesses in tire construction that normal testing hadn't revealed. Goodyear and Firestone developed new compounds and construction techniques specifically for these aerodynamic cars. The inner liner was reinforced, the bead construction was strengthened, and the tread compounds were reformulated for higher heat resistance. These improvements trickled down to passenger car tires within a few years. Ford's engineers discovered something unexpected during development. The car's aerodynamics actually improved with age. As the paint accumulated, tiny stone chips and the panel gaps loosened slightly. With use, the microscopic turbulence actually helped the boundary layer stay attached longer. A well-used Talladega could be 1 to 2 amp faster than a fresh one, assuming everything else was equal. The cost to develop the Talladega went far beyond the published $2 million figure. Ford built 17 different prototype configurations, each requiring extensive wind tunnel time at $1,000 per hour, roughly $8,000 per hour today. They crashed 6 prototypes in high-speed testing to understand aerodynamic stability limits. The computer modeling alone, done on room-sized IBM mainframes, cost $300,000 in computing time. The homologation cars presented unique challenges. Ford had to ensure the street versions were close enough to race specs to be legal while still being practical for daily driving. The extended nose made parking difficult. Drivers couldn't see the front corners. The low-mounted front spoiler scraped on driveways. The flush grille reduced cooling at low speeds, causing some overheating in traffic. But Ford couldn't change these features without losing the aerodynamic advantage that was the whole point. Production was a nightmare of logistics. The Atlanta plant had to modify their assembly line to accommodate the longer front clips. The hoods wouldn't fit in standard shipping fixtures. The extended nose meant fewer cars fit on transport trucks, increasing shipping costs by 15%. Holman Moody's finishing work added 8 to 12 hours of labor per car, driving up costs further. The marketing department didn't know how to sell it. Here was a car that looked almost identical to a standard Torino but cost $840 more. The aerodynamic advantages meant nothing to street drivers who'd never exceed 70 temperature. Ford briefly considered adding stripes or scoops to make them look faster, but that would have hurt the aerodynamics they'd worked so hard to achieve. In the end, they relied on racing success to sell the cars, which worked. All 750 sold within months. Now let's examine the competition's response. Dodge's Charger Daytona was more radical looking but less scientifically developed. The huge rear wing was actually an afterthought. Initial tests showed the nose cone alone wasn't enough. The wing generated massive downforce but also significant drag. At certain speeds, the downforce was so severe it would compress the rear suspension, changing the car's rake angle and actually increasing front-end lift. Drivers reported the car feeling spooky at around 185 miles per hour when these forces reached their worst interaction. Plymouth's Superbird, despite looking identical to the Daytona, was actually quite different aerodynamically. The nose cone was 3 inches longer, the rear window caps were redesigned, and the wing mounting was reinforced after several Daytonas had wings tear off at speed. NASCAR required Plymouth to build 1,920 Superbirds for homologation, more than double the Talladega's requirement because Plymouth had more dealers. Mercury got into the act with the Cyclone Spoiler 2, essentially a Mercury badge Talladega. Only 351 were built, making them even rarer today. Dan Gurney won races in both Ford and Mercury versions, proving the aerodynamic package worked regardless of badging. The wind tunnel wars led to some wild experiments that never saw production. Ford tested a Torino with a full belly pan and rear diffuser that achieved a drag coefficient of 0.24, better than most modern cars. Dodge experimented with a Charger that had motorized panels that would change shape based on speed. Plymouth tried active suspension that would lower the car at speed for better aerodynamics. All were deemed too radical or expensive for production. The safety concerns were real and mounting. Bobby Allison's Talladega went airborne at Talladega in May 1969, flying 30 feet through the air before landing on its wheels. He walked away, but the incident terrified NASCAR officials. The cars were generating actual lift at certain angles. They were literally trying to become airplanes. This led to the development of roof flaps and hood pins, safety features still used today. The tire war between Goodyear and Firestone reached dangerous levels during the Aero Wars. Each company pushed their compounds to the absolute limit, sometimes beyond. Tires were failing after just 30-40 laps at superspeedway speeds. Teams were changing tires so often that fuel strategy became secondary to tire management. The infamous Talladega boycott in September 1969 was primarily about tire safety, with drivers refusing to race on tires they considered inadequate for the speeds involved. The Aero Wars transformed NASCAR's technical regulations. Before 1969, rules mainly concerned engine displacement and basic safety equipment. After the Talladega dominated, NASCAR created detailed body templates, spoiler height restrictions, and air dam regulations. The sanctioning body realized they needed to control aerodynamic development or speeds would spiral beyond control. This philosophy continues today with NASCAR's strict body rules and common templates. The street Talladegas had their own quirks that owners discovered. The extended nose made the car prone to overheating in slow traffic. The airflow that worked so well at speed didn't exist at 25 miles per hour. The front spoiler was vulnerable to curb damage and expensive to replace. The flush-mounted radio antenna reception was terrible. The aerodynamic door glass was so flush it was hard to clean properly, but owners who understood what they had didn't care about these minor annoyances. Let me tell you about one specific Talladega that shows just how special these cars were. Chassis number 9A46Q on 3868, a Wimbledon white example, was bought new by a Ford engineer who worked on the program. He kept every piece of documentation, wind tunnel data, internal memos, test results. When the car sold at auction in 2019, it brought $147,000, but the documentation was valued at another $50,000 by historians. That paperwork provided insights into Ford's development process that had never been public before. The racing engines were remarkable pieces of engineering. The 429 Boss, exclusive to the Talladega and Cyclone, was designed specifically for NASCAR. It featured a semi-hemi combustion chamber design that Ford called Blue Crescent. The heads flowed 290 CFM on the intake side. extraordinary for 1969. The bottom end was built to withstand 7,500 RPM for 500 miles with 4 bolt mains, forged steel crank, and connecting rods that were individually balanced to within 0.1 gram. The race car's weight distribution was critical for aerodynamic balance. Teams would add ballast in specific locations to achieve the perfect 51/49 front-rear balance. Too much weight forward and the nose would push in corners, too much in back and the rear would come around. But get it perfect and the car would slice through the air while remaining stable in the draft. Crew chiefs guarded their ballast positions like state secrets. The end of the Aero Wars wasn't just about safety, it was about cost. The factories were spending millions on aerodynamic development. Chrysler claimed they lost money on every Superbird sold, even at $4,300 each. Ford's racing budget for 1969 exceeded $7 million. The smaller teams couldn't compete with factory aerodynamic development. NASCAR wanted to level the playing field and reduce costs, making the sport more competitive and sustainable. But the lessons learned couldn't be unlearned. Within a decade, every NASCAR team had an aerodynamicist on staff. Wind tunnels became standard tools rather than exotic technology. Computer modeling replaced guesswork. The Talladega had shown that races could be won in the wind tunnel as much as on the track. That philosophy drives NASCAR even today, with teams spending millions on aerodynamic development within the strict rules framework. The collector market for Talladegas has exploded in recent years. Clean, documented examples now sell for $150,000 to $200,000. Race. History adds enormous value. A Talladega that David Pearson drove sold for $445,000 in 2021. Even project cars needing complete restoration bring $50,000 or more. The rarity and racing provenance make them blue-chip investments in the muscle car world. Ford's decision to build the Talladega was vindicated by history. They proved that American engineers could match anyone in sophisticated aerodynamic development. They showed that racing technology could be productionized successfully. They demonstrated that sometimes you have to break the rules to force progress. The Talladega wasn't just a car, it was a statement that Ford would do whatever it took to win. The philosophical question the Talladega raises is still relevant. How much technology is too much? NASCAR decided the Aero Wars had gone too far, but was that the right call? Would unrestricted development have led to even greater innovations? Or would escalating speeds have resulted in tragedy? We'll never know, but the Talladega stands as proof that sometimes progress has to be reined in for its own good. Today's NASCAR Cup cars, with their computer-designed bodies and wind tunnel-tested everything, are direct descendants of the Talladega's innovation. The restrictor plates used at Daytona and Talladega until 2019, and now the tapered spacers that replace them, exist because of what the Torino Talladega started. Every safety innovation, from roof flaps to safer barriers, can trace its necessity back to the speeds these Aero Warriors achieved. The Talladega proved that in racing, as in life, sometimes the biggest advantage comes not from doing one thing better, but from thinking about the problem differently. Ford didn't build a more powerful engine, they built a slipperier car. They didn't overcome air resistance, they eliminated it. They didn't fight physics, they made physics their ally. And in doing so, they created a car so effective it had to be banned, a machine so advanced it changed racing forever. The Ford Torino Talladega remains the car that was too good for its own good. It dominated so completely that the rules had to change. It went so fast that technology had to catch up. It won so much that winning became boring. In the end, the Talladega's greatest achievement wasn't the races it won. It was forcing an entire sport to evolve. And that's the ultimate victory for any machine. To be so revolutionary that the world has to change to accommodate what you've proven possible. What do you think would have happened if NASCAR had let the Aero Wars continue unrestricted? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the machines that changed everything.